Welcome to the Doc and Roll of the 100 Club collaboration online screening and Q&A of the polystyrene I Am A Cliché film. If you haven't watched the film yet, go to the Doc and Roll film website, festival website, and book it via Doc and Roll TV. So let's proceed with the Q&A. What we'd like to do first, actually, is get everybody to introduce themselves, maybe about their specific role in the film, or maybe in Polly's life, whatever. So we'll start with you, Celeste.
Hi, I'm Celeste Bell. I'm co-director of Polystyrene I'm A Cliché. I also co-authored alongside Zoe Howe, Dayglow, the Polystyrene Story.
Paul.
Hi, I'm Paul Sung, co-director of Polystyrene I Am A Cliché.
Gina.
Hi, I'm Gina Birch, and I was in a band at a similar time to Polly, an X-Ray Spex, and I do my voice appears in the film. That's all I know.
Estella.
Hi, I'm Estella Adeyeri. I play bass in Big Joanie, and I play guitar and trumpet. I also volunteer with Decolonise Fest, which is a music festival by punks of colour, for punks of colour. And we've been waiting for this film to come out for a long time. Showed a trailer for it at a previous Decolonise Fest, so that's my link to it.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to start with you, Estella, because it'd be interesting to get a different perspective on this, because it'd be fair to say that you're from a different generation than the rest of us. And the impact that Polly had on you, and like you say, you're looking forward to the film coming out, and if the film was a reaffirmation of that impact.
Yeah, I think Polly's definitely had a kind of enduring legacy in punk, and I think especially among punks of colour, it does feel like she is kind of like an icon that people of my generation do cite quite a lot and still kind of keep her spirit alive, I think, or try to at least anyway. So like, it's interesting for someone who obviously wasn't around in the kind of like late 70s, when like X-Ray Spex was kicking off, and when, you know, like the Raincoats were kicking off and stuff, but like they still massively influential for a lot of bands, I'd say, within the punk scene, feminist punk musicians as well, and still very much relevant to this day.
I mean, what was it? I mean, is the influence because it's inspiration to see a woman, not an unconventional woman, in then rock and roll terms on the stage? Was it the music, the lyrical content, the whole thing really was influential for you and inspiring?
Yeah, I think it's a combination. Like, a lot of Decolonise Fest is based upon reflecting and remembering the people of colour who have been present in alternative scenes. So to have someone with Somali heritage is first of all like a great example of like seeing yourself reflected on a stage, and seeing like a person of colour who is alternative and still quite alternative compared to the punks of the day as well, I think, kind of forging her own look. And I think as well, like the lyrical content about like commodification and consumer culture, again, just stays relevant. So I think that's a huge part of it as well. And yeah, like her attitude, basically like that kind of punk attitude, I think it is the whole of her that's kind of like captured everybody throughout the ages, I think.
And with the film itself, it's what's great about the film, it's not a straight rock and roll doc. We've had too many of those, really. I mean, the story, and it's a difficult story, but despite all that she still managed to do the things that inspire you. So when you watch the film, did it flesh out the story? Do you find it even more inspiring afterwards? You know, what you had to go through to actually get the art and the culture made.
I think one of the things that really stuck with me in the film was the way that like it felt like she was very aware of the impact that being in that sphere was having on her mental health as it was happening. So like when she's saying things like, oh, it's not normal to be told that like you're amazing by all these people in New York who maybe don't really care about you as a person. And yeah, to kind of see someone who was so young, I think I forget how young she was usually as well when all of this was happening. So yeah, to see how that maybe wasn't treated with the gravity that it should have been by the people around her. It's quite upsetting, and I think in an era it feels like a lot of these conversations or a lot of these situations have repeated through time. Like it's coming out around the documentary is coming out around the same time as the Britney documentary, which feels like a similar circumstance, like a very young woman thrust into the spotlight, facing all these criticisms from all angles and being like kind of hounded by the press. And then when she has an almost inevitable breakdown, like people don't really care because they still view her as somebody to consume rather than like a human being who maybe needs some help and some compassion. So that really stuck with me, and it felt quite sad in a way because I think it kind of highlighted how we keep having these scenarios and conversations, and it's like, you know, we all want to improve the music industry and we always talk about women in music and improving things for them, but it's hard to feel like that's a genuine concern when so many women before us have gone through this and keep going through it up to the present day.
I mean, Gina, as a contemporary of Polly and playing a lot of the same venues in the same period of time, and the kind of the contradictions of the hope and expectations of that time, and probably a lot of those hopes and expectations that were dashed. I mean, what was the film like for you to watch? I mean, you probably knew Polly as well, quite well, I guess, from that period.
Well, I didn't actually know Polly very well. I was very in awe of her. I was intensely shy at that period. I mean, we were all kind of thought to be punks, but I think a lot of the young women who were in bands or formed bands were kind of quite shy. I you know, when I see Polly being interviewed, you know, you can tell there's that kind of double-edged sword of her being kind of quite shy and yet obviously very single-minded at the same time. I think, you know, so many of us knew kind of what we wanted, and, you know, we had these kind of mad ideas, but we were, you know, it was like, were you allowed to have them? It was kind of a weird thing. You didn't really know what the boundaries were because you were doing things that hadn't quite been done before. We were lucky because, you know, when we had 4 women in the band, you know, when we were being interviewed, we could kind of have a laugh, you know, or kick each other, you know, follow up with if somebody was having a problem, you know. But I think when there's a woman, I mean, Polly was obviously the main focus of the band. She was the spokeswoman. And so all the focus was on her. All the writing was about her. So I would never have had the courage or the to do a band on my own. I was very interested in working in a collective, in a group. So Polly, intensely brave and intensely powerful and imaginative. And so, you know, that the early Styrene is just, you know, extraordinary. And it's obvious that she was a person who forged her own path. She was very unlike anybody else, and so, you know, when things started to go shaky for her, I don't think she quite knew what to do or where to turn. And you know, perhaps if she'd had I like the guitarist in the band says we were all very selfish, I think, at that time. You know, young people in bands, you're worrying about when the next gig is, or who's sitting where in the van, or who's got this or who's got that. You know, you're kind of thinking about yourself a great deal. And so if somebody's having a problem, you're often usually dealing with your own problems. So that kind of wonderful camaraderie that there is as well also is a bit absent because, well, we were all so young. I think young people today are a little bit more informed, maybe. I like to think so. My daughters seem to be, certainly more than I was. So
did the film itself change your aspect of Polly? I mean, you know, you see a fragility to her, a more complex story, a complexity to her Were all those? Did you kind of know those parts? All those parts
I
were
did really,
surprising for you.
I was, you know, Laura Logic played on our first album. We were really good at getting people who were thrown out of bands. Kate Corris was the first guitarist in the Slits. She got thrown out of the Slits. She came to play with the Raincoats. Then Palmolive got thrown out of the Slits. She came to play with the Raincoats. And then when Laura was thrown out of X-Ray Spex, she did form Essential Logic, but she came and played with the Raincoats. We're like, come and play with us, you know. And so I knew Laura quite well, because when we were recording at Berry Street, X-Ray Spex and us, we'd be doing different shifts in the recording studio. And then I was in Red Crayola with Laura. And so I knew Laura pretty well, and still do. And so I was aware of that, the shift that Laura and Polly made. And of course, with Palmolive became an evangelical Christian. You know, she was on a big spiritual quest. She went in all different, she went in a lot of different directions. So I understand that. I mean, having been brought up a Catholic, I kind of understand the kind of yearning for a kind of spiritual center somehow, something that kind of holds you together, especially when, you know, you're being knocked from all sides in the crazy world of the music biz. It was not exactly biz in our case, but
yeah, anti-biz. Yeah. So Celeste, there's a lot of responsibility to make a film like this. I mean, it's obviously your story. I think one of the great things about this film, it was very much part, you know, your story's in there as well, which I think is really important. And it's, how do you deal with somebody who's has such an iconic status, and it's your own mother, and is such an influential person for people generations afterwards? And yet there's another story as well. The story, you know, a mother's, like you said, not like other mothers, when you said to me last week. Sometimes a difficult person, a brilliant person, a person who found life. Probably, I always thought she was quite an innocent person, really. And so how do you deal with all that? So many different factors, so many different things, so many different responsibilities. Would these weigh on you as you were putting the film together?
I wouldn't say it was weighing on me. I think a great advantage that I have is that she was my mother. So I was, you know, initially it was quite easy for me to separate the person from the from the fame and the recognition and what people know about her based on her public persona. For me, that was always a secondary character that I didn't have too much, you know, to do with growing up. And the person I knew was the person behind that, you know, was my mum, and we were very close, you know, and there was very little that she kept from me. But there were some things, of course, she did keep from me, I think, to protect me as well. But, you know, I had a very close relationship with my mum. And so all of the kind of the aspects of my mum's character that I think maybe would be surprising for people watching the film, you know, so her spirituality, her sensitivity, her philosophical take on life. I mean, you do get that in the lyrics of X-Ray Spex. But I think, you know, the person beneath the facade is someone that I was obviously very much in touch with. And that was, you know, that was the person, that was my mother. So I think that was an advantage, really, because then I never had any kind of concern for the weight, you know, of you know, what she means for the world and all of these things. Of course, I know that, but it's not something that weighs on me, or kind of, I didn't feel any kind of heavy responsibility there. I think the only responsibility I felt and still feel is that it's very important for me that the film was respectful, you know, respectful to my mum's memory, and respectful to trying to be as respectful as I could in terms of what she would want us to say or do, you know, to make the film that she would be happy with, while still being truthful and honest, and also telling my truth as well, you know. So that was probably the difficult balance.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, opening up the character of her, so she's not this when she never was like this kind of Amazonian warrior figure, but actually the fragility of how the world was sometimes quite hard for her to cope with, actually to me makes her even more of an inspirational figure. And is that something you were conscious of as well, or was it just telling the story as you saw it, and as you say, have a responsibility to her as well?
Yeah, I think telling the story, you know, as I saw it, and trying to be honest and truthful and open, you know, that was the main, you know, what I set out to do really. But I also think my mother is not unique in the sense of, you know, that she was fragile and she was sensitive. And I think, you know, for me, that's the interesting story because it's universal. We all have vulnerabilities. We all, especially performers, have to put on a kind of act and have to kind of put on this facade, create alter egos to sort of push ourselves out there. But the person behind that is usually very different. And I think it's sad that an audience or fans, they don't actually want to interact with the real person because they prefer the character.
It's interesting, I think, because I knew her a bit as well, and she definitely blurred Marianne and Polly. You could call her Polly for years and end, and she would never say that's just my stage name.
Yeah.
So did she sort of slip in and out, or were they both facets of her? Or to me, I mean, yeah, there was definitely not. It didn't seem to me like it was a mask and a completely different person that she put on stage. There was definitely a blurring between the two.
Definitely. I mean, my mother had many names. You know, she was born Marion, and she would be called Marie. You know, her friends called her Marie, and then she created, you know, Polly, and everyone would call her Polly, but she would still answer to Marion and Marie, and you know, and then she joined the Hare Krishna movement and she became Maharani, so Hare Krishnas would call her Maharani, and she answered to that. And then later she changed her name actually by default to Marianne because she never liked Marion, and then she actually got a new guru and had a new Hare Krishna name, Radharani. So it was very hard keeping up with all the names, but it didn't faze my mum at all. Like she would answer to any name without problems. But it seems to be something in my family because my auntie also changed her name by default from Margaret to Hazel because she didn't like her name. So I think there's something in my family about not liking the names that we're given and then creating new ones for ourselves.
I mean, this is probably a bit of cod psychology, but do you think this is, you know, the early part of the film deals with the mixed race thing, which is a terrible term, and you know that not really knowing her background and this way that she could sort of shapeshift around different names. Do you think that comes from that, or is that just completely just plucking ideas out of the dark?
No, I think there's an element of that. I think you know, identity and names, you know, your name is well, the name is so powerful, isn't it? Like I'm just going to go onto a tangent, but you know, like to in all the horror films, you know, to get rid of the demon, you have to know its name. You know, there's this idea, like, so yeah, I think for my mum, you know, she struggled with her sense of identity of who she was in her early life, and her way of dealing with that was to create new identities and play with it. You know, she was very playful with her identity, and she was chameleon-like, and she could be many different people, and having different names to go with a different phase or a different sort of you know, different things that she was into at the time seemed appropriate. So yeah, I think there is, you know, there's definitely a connection between having multiple names and having multiple identities.
Do you think you know, the film sort of presents somebody who's, you know, the confusion of fame and the difficulties of dealing with it, and there was a breakdown and then trying to get everything back together, but would it be fair to say in the last 10-15 years of her life that she actually found a happier place to be in generally?
Yes, definitely. And I think I'm so happy that my mother found peace in her later life, because her early life was so, it was so traumatic, and obviously there were good things as well. It was very exciting, but it wasn't peaceful, put it that way. She did not have a peaceful life until she was sort of in her late 40s, early 50s. And I think a lot of that peace came from leaving London. London can be a very hard place to be, especially if you spent your whole life there. I was born in London, grew up in London as well, so I can say that with confidence. And leaving London also meant leaving that kind of world, the scene, because even if she was out of it, she would still be drawn into it, like the music scene and just this world that she was never fully comfortable with. And then I think the other thing is, which we didn't really talk about in the film, but is the menopause. Just going through that life change actually had a positive impact on my mother's mental health, especially. She was, I think, the hormonal, my mother struggled with the hormonal issues very, very badly throughout her life. So just that shift was really good for her. And yeah, she was able to like fully relax, I think, for the first time in many, many years.
Mm-hmm. So Paul, it's a complex film to make. There's a lot of themes, a lot of responsibilities. So were you aware of this as well, or were you just trying to tell a story that was presented to you?
I think, as the film stretched on, I was always aware of the responsibilities. If you're going to make a film about polystyrene, it's a huge responsibility to honour her, to celebrate her. And then, of course, making a film with Celeste, it doubles that responsibility, because it's a film that's also Celestes' story. But, I was lucky as a co-director, because being able to tell a story with the only person who can really tell it, to its full extent, and that is Celeste. So the responsibility was balanced by having the best person to tell the story. And, we've had various, conversations along the way. And I suppose I saw, my role initially of being able to sort of come up with some ideas about how we tell the story. And maybe, we could use the metaphor of a house. And so, obviously Celeste had the story, but putting down some foundations and, putting in things like windows and doors, and then Celeste kind of decorated that house. She furnished that house, and she made that house look beautiful, because she had the story. She, nobody, could tell that story like Celeste. It was a responsibility, one I was acutely aware of. But when you've got a co-pilot like Celeste, then, you're on good ground.
I guess there are difficulties in making a story like this, because obviously nowadays everybody's got the phones, everything is filmed and super documented. But like when you're trying to tell the story of, and the fulcrum of the story, I guess for a lot of people watching the story, is the X-Ray Spex period. And yes, there was that documentary that was made at the time, about 4 bits of live footage and 2 bits of Top of the Pops. I mean, how did you get around that? How did you manage to make that work, without much to play with?
Well, the thing is, with archive, the archive is quite expensive to actually license. And very early on, we made a decision that we would not do talking heads. We would record, interview testimonies, as we did with you and as we did with Gina. And we didn't film them, and we couldn't go back, even at points in the film where we were thinking, maybe we're not going to be able to afford this archive. We never kind of thought, if only we'd filmed it, because we made a creative choice to kind of try and immerse people in the past. Because if you tell a story over, 3-4 decades, if you're seeing a person in the present day talking about it, you're not as immersed in, 1976, for instance. So there was a whole wealth of material, but, we'd shot all this great footage in the locations that we'd gone to that had meaning in Polly's life and in Celeste's life. And we kind of wanted to show that footage off, because, being in those spaces, putting Celeste in the frame and having her wander around back to Vedanta Manor, or what was CBGB's, or in India, it's beautiful footage. And I think, we got it exactly right in terms of the balance, because, we've all seen those music documentaries where it's just solid archive. And I think it can get a bit wearing on the imagination. I think having, these different strands in our film really worked for us.
Yeah, that's one aspect I really liked about the film. It was as much Celeste's story as Polly's story, and I think that was really important. And it's not like I know Celeste, it's not like she's trying to barge in and say this is all my story, but that journey of discovery and about the relationship with the mother, to me, it is the crux of the film. And then I think that's really important. And those scenes of Celeste being on Hastings Pier or in India, I found them really moving, actually, because there was like, if only Polly could have been there as well, in a way. So was that important for you, Paul? Then it was actually, it's not one story here. There's two stories, really, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, it's vital, really. I think, you could have made a film that was, just all Polly and not Celeste, and I'm sure it would have been a good film. But that dynamic, I remember somebody very early on saying to me, "Oh, you're telling the wrong story. It should be X-Ray Spex," and I was really appalled at that, because the story is Polly's, the story is Celeste's role in it, and there are elements of the story that are, like a fairy tale, and that was one of the things that we focused on, and having, Celeste's voiceover, which kind of originated from letters that she'd written, to Polly, just made it so much more personal, because you could watch a film and people could be talking about Polly and saying this and saying that, but it's not as powerful as having Polly's daughter, telling us about the relationship as a mother. And also, Celeste in the film, where it was appropriate, was, I would say, critical of her mum. It wasn't that we were going to just make something that was like, oh, my mum was the greatest mum ever. It's a really well-rounded portrait, and I think that makes it even more interesting. The fact that and she criticises herself as well. She says, I was a little brat at times when my mum wanted to take me shopping and stuff like that, or sit in recording studios. And it's that level of honesty and that level of looking in yourself and looking at your mum and being able to say, listen, she was amazing, she was wonderful, but there were these flaws. My childhood was in some ways traumatic. That just makes it a very human story, and one that most people, I think, can relate to in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I was trying to say initially when speaking to Estella, that it's the idea that the flawed nature of her actually makes her more iconic in a sense. I mean, is that something, now we've got all the way around the conversation, Estella, is that something that you would think from watching the film, that she wasn't Superwoman, but in a sense that she actually was Superwoman?
Yeah, I think, as Paul said, the film does a brilliant job of showing the full spectrum of her and showing her as a full-rounded human being, and not just solely like a punk icon, for example. And so that really stuck out in the film, I think, and going through the before and after of X-Ray Spex and delving into, like you've mentioned, her pathway through spirituality and things like that, and seeing that even at the height of fame, it wasn't necessarily comfortable for her, being hounded by press all the time and stuff. It's not this smooth sailing story that we can wrap up with a bow neatly and finish at the end and end on a high. It's very honest, and I think that feels important to see, really, and kind of it feels very feminist in a way, because it is looking at her interior life and not trying to negate the importance of that.
Do you find her relationship with punk rock quite interesting for somebody who's involved in the modern punk rock scene? Because to me, I mean, she was totally brilliant at it, but in a sense, it's something that she's not natural at either. When you hear more of her later solo records, where they're more singer-songwritery, they feel more comfortable. Even though X-Ray Spex made completely brilliant records, that kind of, making those great punk records despite not being naturally punk rock is something I find quite fascinating about her.
I think it's really cool because she never stopped being herself. And I really liked, a lot comes up in the film about her sensitivity. And that was never something that she tried to quash or felt like it shouldn't be there, even if that's not what we might automatically think of punk as being. And it's well, why not? Why should punk just be this 2D kind of scene? It's not how people are. And so, I think it's quite inspiring to see someone who didn't shrink themselves or shrink any part of themselves to fit in with what she wanted to do. She was always going to be unique and never shy away from those aspects. And I think it definitely influences the bands I'm in as well. The first Big Joanie album ends effectively with a ballad, but we still consider it a punk album. And I think Steph, who does the majority of the lyric writing and always the songs always start with her, I think she kind of takes that influence as well. Like, she might not, I feel like we might not be what people expect when they think of a punk band. But the fact is that, like, Steph lives a well-rounded life and her lyrics reflect her life. So not every song is going to be like shouting against the patriarchy and stuff. It's like, well, we all know, like, we all hate the patriarchy, but like we also have other topics to cover. So
yeah, there's only so many times you can rhyme another word with it.
Yeah. So, you know.
I mean, Gina, this is an interesting thing about punk. I mean, to me, punk was actually far more sensitive than the 2D image of it anyway. I mean, even the blokes could be quite sensitive, like Pete Shelley. Well, actually, we could have quite a long list there. I mean, for somebody who's actually in there, right, pretty well in the middle of it at that time, was it frustrating the way it became a very two-dimensional tabloid version?
Well, I suppose so. I mean, we became known as post-punk, didn't we?
I would actually count you as a punk band because it makes punk feel stronger.
Yeah, well, you know, we you know, I think Polly had that kind of really strident thing, and you know, our first single and the song "Fairy Tale in the Supermarket" was inspired when Anna was watching an early Polly documentary, and she said, "Oh, Polly's stories are like fairy tales in supermarkets," and that's when Anna wrote that chorus inspired by Polly. So
I've always wondered that. So that's actually yeah, wow.
Yeah, lineage of Polly's lyrics, you know. Yeah, I do think that the female punks were perhaps a little more wide-ranging. You know, we all tried to find our own feet in it. Certainly in the UK, I think we, you know, the Slits, Modettes, Delta 5, we all kind of tried to find a different way of being, and make music that was our own. And Polly certainly made music that was her own. Her voice is just absolutely stunning. I love it when she does her amazing kind of foghorn voice in the best sense of foghorn. It just like, where does that huge round sound come from? It's just like, how do you make that sound? It's just fantastic. So, you know, what was the question?
well, that was it. Well, that was it about, you know, the punk was so two-dimensional in the tabloid, not actually as it was in that world, because all the bands were very different.
What do the tabloids know about things? The tabloids always grab hold of a tiny corner of something and then make up what they want to say about it. That you know, and of course, I mean, things that were more sensational obviously hit the headlines, but you know, they're not at the heart of the matter, really. I think punk had a beautiful heart. You know, it was very creative and very sensitive and very inspiring for so many people. I mean, so many oddballs, or people who just wouldn't have got out and about or been able to express themselves creatively in the public sphere, were able to do that through punk and post-punk, and it's an amazing thing, really.
I think that's probably the best description I've ever heard of what punk was.
Okay.
And I'm glad it turned up in a talk about polystyrene as well, because I think that's very fitting. Celeste, do you think there's actually a message that comes out of this film? I mean, it doesn't have to have a message, like music doesn't have to have a message, you know, but is there something you'd like people to take from this film?
I think there are so many things you can take from this film, so it's hard to just pinpoint one. I think what I do hope is that young people, in particular, are able to find some inspiration in my mum's story, because my mum was so young herself when she was, you know, at her most creative and most prolific, and she was just out of school. She left school at 15 without any qualifications, and she did regret that, not finishing her education, but at the same time she just poured all her, you know, energy and her creativity and her intelligence into this amazing music, lyrics, art, you know. So I think that for me is, you know, when I think of people who are also now, you know, teenagers, maybe they're thinking that they're too young, you know, and they maybe have like fear about putting themselves out there. I mean, obviously the film shows you that it does come with huge risks, you know, to risk for your mental health, and hopefully as a society we can be more protective of young creative geniuses. But you know, the inspiration there is that, you know, you can do it yourself. And I think my mum she showed that. She also showed that you can try anything. You know, my mum never let her lack of training hold her back from, you know, making her own clothes or having her own shop or putting her own band together or doing visual art or writing poetry. You know, she tried everything and she was pretty good at everything. You know, but she just sort of put herself out there first, and you have to do that. You know, you have to kind of be prepared to fail, but not, you know, not fear failure, because my mum certainly never did. And when, you know, Translucence, for example, as an album, when that, you know, didn't do well commercially, she wasn't fazed really, because she did it for herself. And because she wanted to do it, and that was always the driving force. You know, she did things because she wanted to do them. When she didn't enjoy doing it anymore, she stopped doing it. So I think that's really inspirational for all of us, but definitely for young people right now.
Did she find a spiritual thing in music? Was there some? Are they two completely different phases of her life, or is there an overlap?
I think there is an overlap. I think you can find spirituality in those early X-Ray Spex lyrics, in Germ for Adolescence lyrics. In fact, you know, there's if not like overt spirituality, it's definitely a lot that's philosophical. And I think philosophy and spirituality overlap. They definitely did for my mum. My mum came to religion through philosophy, really, and I think even just, you know, I've sung, I've been a singer, and I've actually sung in the church. I was in the choir, and I've done a lot of singing in the Hare Krishna temple as well. And I think singing and performing is a spiritual experience in many ways. You know, whether you're doing it in a place of worship or you're doing it on stage in a nightclub, you get the same euphoric feeling. Really, it's very similar. You know, you can really elevate yourself to another place. Just you totally lose yourself in the moment when you're performing. Not even if just performing, even just dancing, or being in the audience. You know, I do think music can be music in itself is quite a spiritual thing. I'm also interested in this idea that, you know, if we think of what is it that makes us human, you know, like what is it that human beings do that's completely different to all the other animals? I think one of the things that we do is we make music, and that's why I think music is, of all the arts, is like the most human, most primeval.
And is that something that that Polly would she talk to you about stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, we used to talk about all of these things, and my mum was, you know, a deep thinker. So she was always thinking, you know, she never just thought about. She could be, in fact, quite dismissive of, you know, my poor grandmother, who would just, you know, like to gossip and talk about going to the shops and things like that. My mum would be very dismissive and just say it's like, oh, it's so mundane, you know, I can't deal with this like mundane chit chat, you know. So she was always like, she wanted to talk about the big things always. So it made for a very interesting childhood. You know, she was a great conversationalist, and she encouraged me to be the same, because I had to, you know, I was always with her. She would just take me everywhere. I would just be sitting there, you know, listening to adult conversations from very, very early age, you know, and I had to just put up or shut up, you know, there was no no complaining allowed. So.
Oh, brilliant. Well, thanks, that's Celeste, and thanks to everybody in the panel. So thanks for giving me time to talk about the great film I'm A Cliché, about the wonderful polystyrene. It's still available on the Dock and Roll Festival website, and you could book it via Dock and Roll TV, and it's up there till Saturday evening. So thank you very much.